So today is March 11th, 2021. And we are joined by Marc Anderson and Emily Mancini to talk about the maturity model for Microsoft 365. Marc, Emily, with that, I'm going to kick it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks very much. Let me see if I can share my screen because, you know, I'm not very good with this tech stuff. All right. And I'm probably sharing the wrong screen, right?
You are indeed.
Man.
Don't worry, it's only on a recording.
How about that?
Much better.
All right. Well, I never do it right. So anyway, well, I'll just because I'm already talking. So Emily and I are going to talk about the maturity model for Microsoft 365, which is something we've been working on with a core team of people who you see across the bottom there. Sadie Van Buren is actually sort of the mother of the maturity model that we're working on because she came up with the SharePoint maturity model back in 2011, I believe. Might have been 2010. I'm supposed to know that. And so, you know, we've got a core team working on it, but it's very much an open source thing, and we'll show you how that works. And it's very much a community thing that anyone can use and contribute to and ask questions about and interact with everybody else. And it's all goodness. And there we go. So who am I? And why am I here? So I'm Marc Anderson. I've been an MVP for a really long time, which is cool because I get to hang out with people way smarter and more interesting than I am. I'm also a member of the P&P team, and this maturity model sort of falls under an effort that I've been heading up around the Microsoft 365 community docs. And I say there are a couple of people like Ralph who are here who are contributors to that. It's a great effort, and you'll see a little bit of that. I wrote this little library called SP Services, and those are laurels upon which I will lie until I die. I really enjoyed doing that. It was a lot of fun. And I'm the president of Simpraxis Consulting, where Emily and I work, and we're two of 6 people, and we work primarily on the Microsoft 365 platform. We love everything about it. And actually we do. It's sort of freakish. I mean, like when we're in private, we talk about the cool stuff that we're doing and how much we like it. We have a lot of fun working together. All right, enough about me.
So I'm Emily Mancini, an architect at Simpraxis Consulting. I'm a Microsoft MVP and also part of the P&P team under Sharing is Caring, and I'll be talking a little bit towards the end about the maturity model practitioners as one of the other ways that you can get more involved. I focus on information architecture and user experience, but I was formerly a Microsoft 365 platform owner and trainer, and that's actually when I met Marc, I don't know, 6 years ago now, probably. So back then, Simpraxis was a partner to the organization, and as a solo platform owner, our organization went from 150 to 1,500 people in the span of 4 years, and that was also our initial Microsoft 365 platform implementation. So a lot of what we're talking about and my interest in the maturity model comes from those experiences, trying to decide where we needed to go, where we needed to be as we were growing so quickly.
You've lived it.
Yeah, big time.
All right. So, Emily, why don't you talk about this? It's more interesting when you talk about it.
Sure. So as Marc mentioned, the SharePoint maturity model was created by Sadie Van Buren back in 2010. So it was built off of the capability maturity model focused on SharePoint. And then last June, we started working on updating it to reflect Microsoft 365, since it's not just SharePoint anymore and all of the different solutions are so integrated. Very quickly after Sadie, Mark, and I started working on it, we put a call out to the community on Twitter, and Simon Hudson and Simon Joy joined us. So the 5 of us have been working on this for the past year, and now we have quite a few different competencies out in the repo, and we're definitely looking for more community engagement as we continue to build.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how sometimes these efforts start. I mean, Emily and Sadie and I started talking, and then I put out that tweet, and we started to get interest, and we started to get people who wanted to help. So, that's what we were talking before we started presenting. About how this global community is so cool, and it's awesome because the two Simons live in the UK, just happen to live in the same country, but there's such a broad reach for these efforts these days. So that makes it a lot more exciting, I think. We get a lot of different perspectives.
Absolutely. So at this point, you're probably thinking, what is the maturity model? So the maturity model helps us align the company on what can and will be done across the platform. So one of the first things is talking about how to improve the organization through the use of technology. So technology is typically most successful when we're using it to solve existing challenges in that organization. So some of examples are maybe you're having challenges raising transparency and decision making. This might be an opportunity for something like a SharePoint communication site or SharePoint news. You can also use the maturity model to benchmark your company and different departments. So it gives us this rubric where we can start to measure the current state, which is really critical when you're measuring growth and tracking that ROI to share with your stakeholders and decision makers. I will totally admit this is the first mistake that I made when I was working at my former organization as a platform owner, that when we implemented, we didn't really talk about that current state nearly as much as we talked about where we wanted to go. So later, when we were having budgetary discussions, it's a lot harder to prove how much we have given to the organization without that initial benchmark. It also helps with some of the softer topics. So a lot of times people are implementing Microsoft 365 to address things like collaboration and communication. So that's really hard to measure with just usage statistics. So figuring out those impacts and those anecdotes of where you are and where you want to be will also help communicating with the business about those real world problems you're solving. Mark's skipping a bit ahead, so selective approach. It's okay, we're just excited, right? So the most important thing, and I feel like one of my top messages around the maturity model, is that it's not one size fits all. And there's no implication here of the different levels of where you should necessarily be. So your company culture, size, goals, and industry are all going to have really big impacts on what the right maturity level is for your organization. As Mark mentioned, Simpraxis is a 6-person company, so we may never be at the 500 level of communication, but quite frankly, we don't necessarily need to be. So there's not a lot of return on investment in those efforts to get there. So again, this model doesn't dictate any levels as better than others, but instead you want to focus on the impacts so you can choose which matters most to support your outcome objectives at your organization. And this helps you develop an organizational, business, and technical roadmap. So now that we've done that benchmarking of current state, talked about the impacts of the future state of where we want to go, we're writing a bunch of different how-to articles to help you navigate how to get from those different points and lead that strategic planning with your senior management. It can also help align implementation needs and objectives. So maybe you're at the beginning of your journey and that's your current state's level 0, right? So you've done nothing and you're trying to decide, well, when we launch, where do we want to be? Some organizations might need to be at 300, for example, for this to really be impactful. So aligning again on these impacts allows you to focus your traditional requirements conversation on those business outcome objectives, which is really about the change that you're seeking and how you're working better together. You can also use this to discuss the use of the platform with IT. Microsoft 365 isn't just technology. So you're helping expand this department's understanding of the system. And again, the different outcome objectives it supports. So better transparency, better collaboration. And you probably have really specific goals on how you want to collaborate better in your organizations. It's also a great socialization tool because majority of the people in your organization who are using Microsoft 365 aren't IT professionals, and they don't spend all of the time that we do in user groups and at Ignite and different things like that to try and understand the platform. So the maturity model can be like a Cliff's Notes version of what's possible. One of the most frequent ways we support our clients is in this idea of the art of the possible. They know they want Microsoft 365, but they're not fully sure what they can do with it to decide what they want to do with it. So being able to use these artifacts to share with your colleagues and increase their understanding is a huge benefit. And even better, it's not something that you need to produce since the community is producing it for you. It's something that you can contribute to. But again, you have a whole community run effort behind it, keeping it up to date and reduce where you need to make separate artifacts for your own organization. Anything to add, Mark, that I skipped over?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes this can be sort of a painful starting point for organizations because essentially, and as outside consultants, we end up doing this sometimes. We're essentially calling the baby ugly, right? We're saying this is how you're doing things, and you could do this better, and here's how you're going to get from where you are to where you may want to be. And that's not the exact same for every organization. And as we talk through some of the levels and the approaches with these competencies, not every organization, as Emily mentioned, wants to be a 500 level for, like the use of the technology itself. I usually think of the 500 level as something like, NASA or Boeing or something, where if they do something wrong, people die. In a lot of organizations, the pressure is a little less than that, even though it may feel like it's a lot more. But understanding sort of as you're going into this, that you're going to be ruffling some feathers, you're going to be pointing at some things that you need to do better is a little hard. But then what we're trying to focus on too is giving you tools to understand, well, how can we get better at this particular thing? And what does that look like? So we're getting there, and we want to have a bunch of tools that will make that process for you better. So that's the approach here. We're trying as much as possible. And by the way, ask questions in the chat. Feel free, and if you want to come off mute and say, Mark, you're an idiot, that's not true. Well, you're welcome to do that too. We definitely want to have this be as interactive as we can. So one of the things we're trying really hard to do is not be technology specific or not driven by today's features. We know that Microsoft is always bringing out new things. They're always renaming old things. The landscape changes. With Microsoft Viva, that sort of rebundled some things that existed and brought some new things out. So we're trying to focus more on what business outcomes are you aiming for, and how do you think about getting to those, as opposed to, well, here's what you do with Planner. It's not that we're not mentioning the technologies, but we're trying to lead with the business goals first. And there's the next bullet. So I said that already. I think that's a mistake that I see a lot of IT organizations doing, and you probably all lived this to some degree. IT decides that we should have SharePoint, for example. Let's go back 5 or 10 years, and they roll out SharePoint and say, all right, everybody, go collaborate. But maybe no one really understands what that means, or why it's important, or how they really should use it in that organization. So we're really trying to focus on that stuff. Everything that we talk about is based on some sort of competency, and I will show you the map of those competencies. But there's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of overlap. There may be different ways that your organization thinks about this stuff. So what we've documented and what we'll go through is really more of a guide for you, just like a travel guide is something. If I buy a book about France and I go to France, I decide which parts of that travel guide I want to follow and which parts I want to ignore. The key, as we've already talked about a little bit, one key here is to evaluate your current state. Where are we in the grand scheme of things? and what do we think about that? Because not every organization thinks about it the same way. And then the other part that's really important is that this isn't just for technical people, and we probably will say that over and over again. In fact, it's probably more important for the non-technical people. It's really about people in the organization anywhere. It doesn't matter where they sit. It doesn't matter whether they're in IT or in marketing or in the executive suite or whatever. It's about helping your organization to get to specific goals regardless of what your day-to-day job is. So we think that this model is actually useful for anyone, from the mailroom to the boardroom, from IT to marketing to you name it. It's not geared to just a technical audience. So I'll keep going here, and within each of these competencies, we talk about different levels, and this is the content maturity, or sorry, the CMM, the original CMM, capability maturity model. My brain almost didn't work. The words are right there on the screen in front of me. Was actually developed by Carnegie Mellon back in the 70s to talk specifically about software development. It's been applied to everything that you can possibly think of, sometimes well, sometimes not well. But the basic idea is within any particular discipline, and we're using the term competency, in the competencies, there are different levels. And again, it's gray. Am I a level 2 or a level 3 or a level, we've actually got them numbered 100 to 500. Are you a 222 and a half? That's not the point. It's that you're sort of generally marching up this ladder to a point where you want to be. And again, it may not be the top level, so that you're performing at your best. So level 1 is where most things start. Those early SharePoint rollouts where the server was sitting underneath somebody's desk was absolutely level 100 or level 1. It was, you're sort of throwing things against the wall. You're seeing what sticks. The permissions are wide open. It's sort of a technology free for all. I think surprisingly, there are a lot of organizations that are at that same level. It may be because they're an organization where only one person manages the Microsoft 365 platform, and they just can't get their arms around all of it. It's not like it's some sort of badge of dishonor. It's just a reality that in many cases, when you look at the different capabilities, you may be at the sort of initial level. So just sort of reactive, and unorganized sounds like a bad thing, but sort of trying to deal with everything without being able to work smartly and effectively, I think. Level 2 is managed, where we start to organize things. We start to understand where things should happen, who should be doing what our policies are. We're starting to think about governance, but we probably don't have a full governance idea, plan or ideas documented. Level 3 is more defined. We do have some very clear thoughts about our governance. We've started to communicate those out. There's more of a shared mental model about how we think about the things we're trying to accomplish with the platform, and therefore we're using the platform better in order to reach those goals. Quantitatively managed, which is level 4 or 400, is where we start to actually measure and manage based on what's happening. So let's take an example of search. We often have turned on search, and then people say it doesn't work because they can't find anything. Well, at level 400, you're starting to look at you're effectively looking at, well, what are people searching for? We're generating content to meet those needs. We're iterating on that process so that and we're configuring search over time so that we're starting to provide much more optimal search results. People see search as valuable, and we're a learning organization. We're starting to come back and readapt our search settings and stuff. And then when we're in the optimizing level, the level 500, this is this nirvana that you may or may not ever choose to get to, but you're really taking the use of the platform and using it to refine the processes that it's supporting. So you're thinking about not just, oh, we rolled out this Power App and it's got some flows and that's great and everything's humming, we're done. But you're looking at, well, what are the usage patterns of these things and what can we learn from it? And how can we think about working with our customers better or our vendors better? You're harvesting the patterns, and you're seeing Microsoft come out with some things that actually help you do some of this stuff with Viva, for example, and actually letting the usage of the technology and the platform change the way you do business in a predictable and manageable way. And the next slide, there we go. So like I said, there are these 5 levels, and there are a lot of words on this slide, and I'm going to read every single one of them. No, I'm not going to. But this is a slightly more wordy way for you to think about framing this. What words do you want to use, and the keywords on the right can be really helpful, especially when you're say you're going to your manager, or you're going to a steering committee meeting or whatever, and you want to start bringing up these topics. Those words can really help you have those conversations. This is not about scaring everybody and saying, oh, we're horrible at this. It's about coming up with a recognition that there are places that you not only can you do better, but you should do better because it's a strategic priority for your organization. The way you present this actually matters a lot, because some of it is going to require functional and cultural changes within your organization. This has been true ever since the earliest days of SharePoint, where you roll it out and you say, oh great, now we're going to collaborate, which is my favorite example of ineffectiveness. You have to be having a lot of stuff happen offline to make that online experience make any difference at all. So hopefully sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I was gonna say, I have another one that we run into all the time, right? Where maybe someone says, I want to automate all our business processes. And then we ask what the business process is, and they don't know what it is yet. So if you look at this chart, automated's at the 500 level. You can't just skip there. There's stuff that happened in 200 and 300 to make that governance, make the business process, get that repeatable step that you could then automate once you've done those.
Right. Yeah,
so you can help talk to your stakeholders of how hard it is, right? You can't just go from 0 to 500 for that.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's very difficult to skip levels. If you happen to have an organization, I've worked with a few as clients who are just humming along and they are just good at everything. You all work at one of those places, right? Raise them up. And so they can sort of jump right into a level 300 maybe, because there's just a learning curve, if nothing else. But if you bring a lot of good thinking to something, you may land at level 300. Most of us start at level 100 with everything, and that's true of anything in our lives. You have a kid and you're like, oh crap, what do I do next? That's level 100. By the time your kid ours is 16, almost 17. I'm not sure we're optimized, but at least we're probably a solid level 300. We know when to scold him and when to let him do what he needs to do. So there's a learning curve and sort of a maturity model with everything. And yes, when you're sort of into a model like this, you tend to apply it to everything in your life. I apply knowledge management to my grocery shopping because I think knowledge management is so cool, but I think that this is sort of a universal usefulness without being too ridiculous about it. So these are the competencies that we've decided to break things down into. We took the competencies that Sadie had in the original SharePoint maturity model, and obviously SharePoint is one small piece, one really important piece of the Microsoft 365 platform, or the efforts that come along with the platform. And we tried to come up with what are the buckets that we can think of helping people improve on. And you'll see things that probably make a lot of sense that sort of you've seen traditionally, like customization and development. That how do we build good systems? But some of the other stuff might be a little squishy, especially if you're inside the IT organization. Things like collaboration and communication. How do you know if you're good at that, and how do you get better at it? And that's what those supporting articles on the right side at least on my screen, are about, which is, okay, you're at a level 200. What do you do to get to level 300? What are the actions you can take? It's one thing to say, this is where we are and this is where we want to be, but what steps can we take to get from one place to the next? And we have a couple of competencies in the middle there that we haven't got any documentation on yet. We're always looking for help. And the things that are published aren't necessarily done either. We're always wanting people's input. What's worked, what hasn't, how can we think about things better?
So as we mentioned, we love discussion. So feel free to come off mute, share your thoughts, share your camera if you want as well. We have a couple of questions. We'd love to hear more about what maturity challenges you're facing in your organization.
Come on, folks.
So I don't have a question so much as a comment. I'd love you guys to talk about more, which is the maturity model. First of all, I really love everything I'm seeing. I'm going to do a lot of reading on this because this is really exciting stuff to see the way you've documented it. But a lot of my customers, their concern with an approach like this is they see it as a do everything and then go to, they see a waterfall approach, not an iterative or agile like approach. So you talk about how you introduce this concept from a more agile approach. Is that something you recommend, and how do you do that with your customers?
So it's a good question. I'll go a bit more in depth after some of these questions around writing things like business outcome objectives and how you map the maturity model to them and use those articles. So I'll save the how-to for a little bit later. I think one point that we haven't called out is that you don't need to be at a high, at the same level for everything. So it is really a pick and choose for each of them. And there might be some competencies that an organization decides aren't a priority. So I think in those initial conversations where when we're talking about what the business challenges are, so the organization where I was, it was transparency and decision making, communication across different regions, and having a central place for people to be working, because this was in the world of, well, all those documents are managed in my email, right? So we had some pretty clear ways that we needed to work on communication and collaboration. So we just focused on those ones first. We didn't necessarily dive into things like customization and development and search and management of content or the business processes. So we definitely take little bits as it makes sense on our roadmap.
I think that the other, to me, it doesn't feel like a waterfall kind of thing, and it's definitely not a do everything. I mean, I think you sort of look at these competencies and you say, well, what do we want to get better at right now? But the key there is I have to understand where we are, and that look is something that a lot of organizations just haven't done. They just don't think about it, and what we're trying to help with here is to help frame that thinking. How can we decide where we are in the grand scheme of things, and which things do we want to focus on, and given what we focused on, how do we get from level this to level that, and how long is it going to take us? It's not prescriptive in that sense. It's here's some framing and some constructs that you can use. You choose how to do that. We're not trying to tell anyone how to specifically do it, but we're giving some ideas.
Yeah, no, that is definitely great, because you can't build the staircase for everybody to get from A to Z.
Right.
But now I know somewhere around JK and M, I'm going to run into problems with staff and training.
Yeah.
I should prepare for that while I'm at A, and I better find out where A is first. So this is
Right.
this is great stuff. And it's going to help too, like you said, with, because you asked, like, okay, is anybody doing this now? And yeah, no. I have a government client, and they're notorious for, I made you an IT, why aren't you collaborating yet?
Right.
That's, yeah.
I mean, I think you can even apply this thinking in very micro situations. I was talking to a client this morning about they have a bunch of accounts that are not actual people, right? They're users who aren't users. And it's constantly a problem because they show up in the search results and all that, people pickers and all sorts of other stuff. And so the discussion started out as, how do we solve that for this one particular list? Like how do we permission this particular list? And I tried to push the conversation up to, well, let's not solve it for this list. Let's try to solve it for the organization so that we don't run into this in other lists, right? So that in itself is a little bit of an escalation up the maturity model, right? You're not solving a point solution. You're not being reactive. You're trying to come up with a solution that's going to, apply on a broader level and solve more problems. Yeah, I'm bringing it up because I sounded totally brilliant when I did that. It's not that simple all the time. It doesn't mean that you can wave a magic wand, but that's a very simple example of something where you can sort of bring this, maturity sort of way of thinking to smaller conversations. It doesn't mean that, oh, now we've just jumped from level 100 to 300. But if we're trying to solve things more like a level 300 organization, we're going to end up landing there over time.
To your point of forecasting, it's also so helpful for smaller organizations where so many of the clients that we work with might be one IT person who handles everything, and Microsoft 365 is completely new to them. So maybe we're focusing on collaboration and communication in the beginning, but that's also going to impact their staff and training. And sometimes, as that one solo IT person talking to these business stakeholders, it's hard to justify things like more headcount. But if you have this other resource over here that says, well, here's some negative impacts to staff and training. If we stay at this level, here's the risks. You have this outside source also supporting you. So that's another thing that I found really helpful of when your organization is facing some of these challenges, as using this as a justification. Any
other specific challenges? When you look at this list of competencies, if you named one that you think your organization is struggling with the most, which one would it be? And struggling might be a little bit of an overstatement. Which do you think is a bigger challenge for you?
There's
Business
not all
process.
of the above.
Pick the top one, Robert. No, business process right up front. So many times. I need you to automate my business processes. Okay, what is it? I said I need you to automate my business process. So when are you going to start sending out? When is the SharePoint going to start sending out the emails? Okay, so we're not even what? No, that's stop.
Yeah, and that's not a technology challenge. It really isn't. It's a person and process challenge, right? So oftentimes those situations, it's like, well, IT doesn't get it, right? Or the business systems people don't get it because they're not giving us our workflow or our flow. Well, it doesn't work that way, right? I mean, you need to be able to define your process and articulate it to us so that we can build a flow. And taking people through that exercise actually raises their level of competency in business process. I always say that a business process observed is a business process changed. If somebody says, "Oh, just do exactly what we had in that old SharePoint designer workflow in SharePoint 2010," it's like, no, I won't do that because your process has probably changed. Let's think about what a good process would look like. Oh, I can do that? Yes.
It's exactly the conversation I had yesterday with someone. Hey, I need you to add this column to this 2010 workflow we made in 2014. And oh, by the way, things have changed since then, but I think I can solve it with just this extra column. Okay, that's got info path and attachments. And no, I'm not doing that. If you want me to open this up, we're going to do it right.
Yeah, and they don't know the real business processes, yet they want us to try and figure out, I need this to work, just go do it.
Right. Well, as a technical person, I'd like to think that if you read through some of these articles that we've got, and we'll show you some, assuming that we don't eat up all of our time by talking too much, which is my problem. you know, as technical people, I think you can use some of these articles as ways to discuss with, and I hate using the phrase the business because everybody's in the business unless you're not a business. It's ways to frame things, right? It's not about saying, well, if you don't understand it, we're not going to fire up a project because it's a waste of our time, which is often the way it feels like IT is talking to the organization. It's talking about, you know, well, what, you know, how do we define good processes, and how do we think about improving those processes so that we can implement something for you that is actually going to make you better than you are today. And I think, again, this all can be fodder for, you know, the organization talking to IT talking to the organization, marketing talking to executives, whatever, so that you can start to frame what it seems like needs to happen in order for us to be more successful.
So we're also curious on if anybody is using maturity models now, and if so, how, or if anyone that's in this meeting has started to read the maturity model that we've been building, and if they have any feedback. I see we got a lot of typers.
Yeah, Kathleen, your point is that people don't know the mission statement. That's a really common problem. I used to work for a company that actually created the balanced scorecard, so I have sort of that in the back of my brain. Everybody needs to understand what the strategic objectives of the organization are and how they fit into them. And if they don't, they're definitely likely to be doing things that are counter to those strategic directions. So, you know, from a communication perspective, which we'll talk about a little bit more, making sure that the organization even understands what the mission statement is. And that doesn't mean you stick it on the front page of the intranet and all of a sudden everyone's behavior changes. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be a concerted effort to help people understand where they fit in the world.
We just got some good answers in the chat. So some people are not using it yet. Kathleen's trying to implement some of it in her new position. And Jay made a really good point that although they may not, you may not be following the formal maturity model, a lot of what we're describing fits with what you say to customers. And that's a great point. This is putting a rubric and a framework and a language around something that everyone might already be doing. And sometimes just even that documentation and pointing to the same documentation can help bring everyone up to speed at the totally same level. So I would agree that our goal is that this maturity model reflects a lot of the ways that we're already working with this modern intelligent intranet.
Yeah, it's another. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Mark. I'll echo what Jay's been saying. I've been following the SharePoint maturity model for a long time as well, and preaching that to customers along the way. And while not using necessarily the same vocabulary or anything like that, it all goes back to, you know, where are you at today? What are you trying to get to? Do you know what you have in front of you? And back in the day, it was, hey, help us deploy SharePoint. And what does that mean? Like, where does it stop, right? So I think that's kind of a bit what we're saying here as well, is you go from 100 to 500 and back down depending on what you're talking about. Could be forms, could be work processes, could be whatever, could be just, you know, getting from file share to SharePoint libraries and using metadata, right? You can be all in different parts of the spectrum along that model. And going back to your first question, if I can, you know, what I'm still finding is a lot of organizations, whether it's coming at us from the business or coming at us from IT, there's still a lot of, we don't, you know, here's where we're at. 2020, we had to rush out teams, or, you know, I don't know where I'm at with my SharePoint. I didn't even know that SharePoint was connected to Teams, things like that. So there's still a lot of that going on, and help us deploy Teams or help us deploy SharePoint. Again, it's like, it's not really about that. Like, what are you trying to do? Where do you understand even what your licensing gives you? And yeah, where are you at with some of your business processes, and how does that all align? So I'm actually getting it from both now, which is kind of interesting. Before it was all coming from IT, coming from the technical side, saying, help us do this and get it to the business, but you're not talking to the business. So how do you know what you want to do? And then now I'm seeing a little bit of, oh, hey, we have teams and we created teams and this is all cool. And IT doesn't know what they're doing. That's why we're reaching out to vendors to help us. So I'm getting the gamut. from about the maturity model as far as their journey into 365. And so that's kind of where my struggles are, is they don't even know what they have in front of them to begin with. And so part of my challenge is often giving them here's what you actually have, and because oftentimes we're talking about teams, and mostly teams, and then of course SharePoint behind that. It's about, when you do this is what happens, and we all know the complexities of that, I guess. But yeah, it's getting everybody up to speed on a level playing field, and then you can start talking about some of this stuff where it's like, okay, then what? Now what's your journey? Now what's your mission? Now what do we want to do? Now what are your business processes? So I wouldn't call it a level 0, but it almost is that. It's almost like resetting everything so that we can get to, okay, where are we at with which piece? Some of it's level 100, some of it's level 300. Oh, you're actually using Power Apps, so I guess that's sort of 400, 500, right? It's all over the place, and it's actually quite interesting and fascinating. And I've loved the SharePoint maturity model ever since Sadie put it out way back when.
Yeah, you've been around a long time with this stuff. I know we've talked about it somewhere.
Yeah.
I think that there's definitely a lot of, I don't know what I have and I don't know how to use it. But if you focus on the outcomes, like we got to roll out Teams. Well, why? Like, what are you trying to do? Well, Microsoft says we need Teams. That's not a reason, right? That's a sales pitch, and not that it's bad, but it's a sales pitch. I think that organizations need to understand what it is they're trying to accomplish, and when Microsoft decides that it's the year of the whatever, it's the year of the whatever for them, not for you. The outcomes that you need are the outcomes that you need. And so what are the tools that you can use in order to get there? And, I always joke, but I don't really joke. Sometimes it's note cards. It can be really simple solutions that get you to greater levels of competency. But if you don't think about it, you're never going to get there. If you don't realize where you are, you're never going to get there. If you're writing a Power App every time anyone ever asks you for anything, you're not being sophisticated. You're just hitting using the same hammer every single time. Well, in the interest of time, I think we'll skip this question, the communication one. So what we wanted to do is focus a little bit on one of these competencies and show you, well, what does that mean? We've been talking in sort of a general sense, what the maturity model approach is, why it exists, what you can use it for. But let's sort of come down to brass tacks. So each of the articles that we're talking about here, and again, these are sort of framing articles. We're hoping to have tool sets and analytics things. In a sense, it's early days, even though we've been working on this for, I don't know, at least a good solid 6 months. Not our day job, but we're trying to put a lot of effort into it. Each article has very specific sections that are consistent across all the competencies. So if you read through one of the competencies, it should make sense to read through one of the other competencies. So what you see on the right side of your screen is sort of the top of that communication competency article. What you see on the left is that it's a very long thing, and it's got a bunch of sections, and it talks about each of the levels. And within each of the levels, we tried to break it down into concepts that make sense for that particular competency. So let me actually hop over to a browser and show you where all of this is and how can you get there really easily. So there's an AKA-MS link, which is in our deck, AKMS M365 Community Docs, and that's the only link I remember, and that gets me to the the Microsoft 365 community content. This maturity model sits within that effort, as I mentioned earlier, and it's sort of over here to the right or there, okay? So we've got a bunch of articles and a bunch of concepts there that are all about the maturity model. We're going to dive into that communication. I can't save any money doing this. I'm going to dive into the communication competency to take a look at that particular article. There are a couple things I want to show you here that are a little tangential. First of all, there's a button here that says edit. Everything on docs.microsoft.com these days has that button. It's an edit button. And it's a really important button to us as repo owners. If you click on that, you actually are into the GitHub repo that shows the article that you're reading, and you can take an edit action here. So I can edit that file. This looks intimidating, but it really isn't. So, we get contributions all the time like, oh, you spelled smaller wrong, so I'm going to fix that, and I'm going to do a pull request for that. You make your changes. Oops. You make your changes, you come down to the bottom, you fill this out, you push the commit changes button, and actually I think you would get a submit pull request button on the admin. And so then you can start to improve what's in these articles. Improvements can be anything. It can be spelling fixes up to writing whole new branches of concepts here. So I want to encourage you all to do that. We have a slide at the end talking about how you can contribute. So for each one of these articles, again, this is the communication one. We have the, too long, did not read, overview of the concepts. This is what you can have your boss's boss read. A definition of what we're actually talking about. What Microsoft 365 tool sets tend to support this competency? And again, it's not because you have to use Yammer or we believe that email is the only way to communicate. It's that these are probably the things that you might see people using in the context of solving these particular communication challenges. For each level, we have a little bit of a definition of what it looks like for this particular competency, right? So the words are not the same in every one of these, right? Communicating in an organization is always a challenge, and very few people say, oh, in my organization, everybody knows everything that they need to know when they need to know it and in the format they need to know it. It's really unusual, right? So we think that, generally speaking, somebody is not often at a 500 level for this. We talk about governance and security. We talk about information architecture. We talk about what content might be helpful at each one of these levels. So I'm not going to read through this, but the point is that as you read through, if you chose to read through this article, and I've done this a lot. I've been reading these articles until I'm blue in the face because I'm the one who is like the editor of things. As you read from the top to the bottom, you'll say, oh yeah, we're past that. I think we do that pretty well. Yeah, we're not so good. Like when people give us feedback, we don't always do anything with that. And we're just using news. We're not actually, thinking about, well, what tool in our portfolio should we use for each kind of communication. So you'll sort of get to a point where you're like, I think we sort of sit here, and it's not scientific. I've sort of read through this and I understand that describes us better than we're not doing this, right? So it's that kind of ranking. It's not like you're going to take some sort of 22 question test, a practice SAT that's going to get you there and tell you exactly what level you're in. And then down at the bottom of each one of these articles, we have some scenarios that might be helpful to just use to think about it. The CEO shares a story about key new partnership that the organization has entered. How does that happen in your organization if something like that happened? Would you know how that, would you know what mechanism to use? Would it be like, oh yeah, we'll just, we'll do this. He has a blog, we're going to put it on his blog. We're going to post it in the executive whatever. Or is it something where you'd sort of scramble because that helps you frame how good are you at managing communication, not just from a technical perspective, but from a process perspective. And then some notion of cost and benefit. I've been doing knowledge management consulting for decades. It's very hard to come up with an ROI for collaboration or communication. It's just difficult. So in cases like some of these fuzzier competencies, they may be anecdotal. They may be concepts that are a little bit, like I said, fuzzy, but they still matter. And then some resources to learn more. And we're trying to make a lot of this content be sort of intermeshed. You can learn more about one thing by learning or by reading another thing. So that's just a quick guide to one of the articles. Go ahead, Emily.
I was going to say, since you just talked about some high-level examples, if you don't mind switching us back to the slides, I think we have some specific outcome objectives we can talk through a little bit. Oh, wrong one.
And I'm going to swap slides again. There we go.
Awesome. Thank you. So you might have heard of things like the Adoption Hub, so adoption.microsoft.com. And we love using the Adoption Hub and see a lot of overlap with where the maturity model can help you on those initial journeys. So looking at the Adoption Hub, they have different phases, and where we've talked about so far, they define it as phase one, a define your business strategy. So this is a bit where you're writing your outcome objectives and identifying those business scenarios. So similar to what Mark was just saying, maybe you read the article, you get some good ideas on scenarios, and then you actually start to write your own. So if you've seen these before, they're the statements of I want to, as a role, and then what your goal is. And we'll go through some of those exact examples. We also talked about how it can help you assess your readiness. So that benchmarking, using the maturity model as you're following on this adoption journey as that tool to have that common framework for the conversations with your colleagues. And then skipping, phase two is the actual implementation of those things. So you may be looking at it as a reminder as you go through, but phase three, when you're headed towards that ongoing engagement and those feedback cycles of, okay, now we're at this point, where do we want to keep going? Because as we all know, Microsoft 365 is an evergreen environment, and we're continually trying to work on our maturity and where we're advancing. So let's take a peek at one of the pages in the maturity model, in the Adoption Hub, and let's talk a little bit about define business strategy. So if you hop over to the next slide, I think I have a little,
Sorry. Yep.
no worries, animations. And then the next one where we have our, perfect. Okay, so identifying our business scenarios and our use cases. So let's just talk a little bit about some communication use cases that we have really quickly. So as an HR manager, I want to share localized benefits updates using SharePoint News, and I'll know this is successful when each region sees only their specific updates to benefits. We also have a marketing manager who wants to have consistency in the logos and templates across their organization so that all employees can be using this consistently. And last but not least, we have senior leadership who wants to have this high priority company news, and they want their news to be above everybody else's on the intranet because it is the absolute most important piece. And they want this to happen just automatically. They want the intranet to know I'm a senior leader and my news is the most important. So at this point, I'll skip over us actually going to look at the article since Mark gave you a view of it, but you go through and you can read that article and focus on the impacts and align that with your when you are successful and decide where you want to be. So we have some ranges here. As Mark pointed out, it's not always an exact science where you're going to get one answer. So for that HR manager, for example, level 200 begins targeting information, but there's not a ton of user awareness. So it's hard to say, would HR maybe be part of this pilot group? Maybe they're the ones that are going to first start using it at 200. Or do we really want this to be consistent and we want to focus on maybe being at the 300 level so that user awareness is improved and that localization is fully supported by the IT group? Then let's say we're looking at this marketing manager. The 300 level is the availability of the logos. Maybe we're just putting it on a comm site in a library. But then if you look at the 400 level, maybe we're going a couple steps further for centralizing our content and using something like organizational assets. So it appears across consistently all those site collections, and there's only one spot where you have to update it. And there's a lot less friction for our end users to get to that content. Last but not least, we have the senior leadership. And right now, for that automation of their news stories to be prioritized, that's something like a 400 level. But this doesn't always have to be so difficult. There's different things always coming out in Microsoft 365. And one example that we're getting later this year is Boost News. So maybe Boost News is really going to help lower that to a 200 level at a later date. So at this point, when we're looking at these business scenarios with our leadership team and our steering committee, we can have a conversation with them around this range of where the different numbers are and say, okay, let's decide as a group which one we're focusing on. And my recommendation for this group would probably be the 300 level, because it looks like that's a really strong start for the HR and marketing needs, and it'll set us up really well as we try to head into what senior leadership wants.
I think that there's a hint at another level of maturity there in what Emily was talking about, knowing what's coming and realizing that you don't have to build custom stuff because there's a new capability that's on the roadmap that you can rely on, hopefully. That means that you're not just your knowledge of the platform is good, and you're not expending work where you don't need to. How many times have you seen in organizations they build something and then Microsoft comes out with something 3 weeks after they're done, and they've been telegraphing it for 6 months? That's just a shame when you see that. I think we're again, in the interest of time, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. Emily, do you want to talk about the determined readiness aspect of things?
Yeah, I'll just to hit it again really quickly because we talked about it earlier, and we really want to be able to show you those contribution opportunities. So this idea that after we did those different outcome objectives, looked at the impacts for the future, again, we still need to benchmark. We still need to see where we are. So then revisiting the articles and reading them from a different perspective to say, where are we actually now with the impacts, knowing that we want to get to that 300 level. And if it's an implementation, you're at 0, right? Because you haven't necessarily started it just yet.
And we have a spreadsheet which we will actually come up with a way to we have a link to it, right? On the last slide we did.
Yes, we do.
So this is just a screenshot from that thing, but it basically, think about this is a way that you can start to think about where you sit in the maturity model for each of the competencies, this little spider web thing. And if you decide that you're going to sort of make that informal metric every 6 months or every year, you ought to see yourself going out in that spider web where the tasty flies are. So understanding that you have goals and that you're starting to improve toward those goals, I think, is just as important. And you want to make that sort of self-assessment as publicly available as possible. This is an opportunity to work out loud and to bring everyone along with you on the journey, as opposed to having some IT skunkworks in a back room where you're saying that everything's going great, but you're not sharing it with anybody. They don't know what's gotten better. They don't know what's improved. So I think it's very important to keep yourself, sort of vocal and public about what you're accomplishing.
We should probably skip ahead, Mark, to 26.
Let's go to 26, shall we?
Yeah. So we've mentioned contributions a lot, and we have I think some builds on this one, but there's a lot of different ways to do it. And it could be as little as socializing. So sharing the different links to the articles and talking about it with your organization. Asking questions to us. So being part of this user group, being part of these discussions, thank you so much. This is a huge value add for us as we explore and help build this with the community. We love any recommendations for changes, that feedback, sharing your experiences, joining the Microsoft maturity model for Microsoft 365 practitioners, which we have a specific slide on, and we'll give you the meeting details. But again, contributing content as well. So if you have any product specific articles, implementation guidance, or want to contribute to those open competencies, don't hesitate to reach out to Mark or I to hear more about that as well. We'd love to help support you in that. And there's things like Sharing is Caring training sessions where you can hands-on work in the GitHub repo as well.
Yeah, there's really no contribution too small, and there's no we find the most wonderful things in the smallest interactions sometimes, and I want to encourage any one of you, if you have some thoughts, if you have a story that you think is interesting, if you have a spelling fix, we'll take it. Anecdotes are wonderful. We tried this at our organization, and this is what happened. We'd love to be able to maybe disguise it, but still include that in ways people can think about success. So if you have any thoughts like that, we'd love to hear them.
So lightning quick, because I know we're in our last minute. So the Maturity Model Practitioners is a new monthly meeting, and it is a safe space to hone your pitch, test your thoughts, talk more about this. It's definitely discussion based. So think of primarily the 45 minutes of us discussing different use cases each different month. And then if you go forward, perfect, there's some of our resources. I've been trying to drop them all into the chat as we've gone along. I'll add in that sharing is caring link now. And the details for our meeting for maturity model practitioners is on our last slide. April 20th. Oh, that's the next one. I'm so sorry. I was so excited. I took this from our deck. It's actually Tuesday, March 16th at 7 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. And then the one after that is April.
It says March 16th. Look.
Yeah. Thank you, Mark. This is how you know that I'm too far in advance to the future. Perfect. Okay, I will give you that spider web self-assessment tool in the chat right now.
And we'd love your thoughts on that. That's an Excel spreadsheet that Sadie had actually started with, and we haven't done a lot with. So if you start to fiddle with it, we'd love your thoughts. That's a place where we could definitely have some improvement.
Oh, I'll kick the tires. I'll run through some paces. Absolutely will.
Excellent.
And with that, thank you for having us and letting us run up to that very last